For an empire that stretched across mountains, rivers, and languages, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was strangely quiet in one crucial way. It could not agree with itself. Millions lived under one crown, yet no single identity truly held them together. Laws were written to balance differences, but each compromise seemed to deepen the divide. It looked stable, even dignified. From the outside, yet inside, tension moved slowly, almost gently, like a crack spreading through glass. How can something so vast begin to unravel without anyone clearly seeing the moment it starts? What made the Austro-Hungarian Empire unusual was not its size, but the way it came into existence as a compromise rather than a conquest. In 1867, after years of internal strain and military setbacks, the Habsburg monarchy faced a problem it could no longer ignore. Hungary, one of its largest and most historically distinct territories, had grown increasingly resistant to centralized rule from Vienna. The revolutions of 1848 had already revealed how fragile imperial authority could be when confronted with demands for autonomy. Although those uprisings were suppressed, the underlying tension never truly disappeared. Instead, it lingered quietly, shaping the decisions that would follow. By the mid-19th century, the empire had also suffered defeats abroad, most notably against Prussia in 1866. This loss weakened Austria's influence in German affairs and forced its leadership to reconsider how to maintain stability within its own borders. The solution they arrived at was not to unify more tightly, but to divide power in a controlled way. The Compromise of 1867, known as the Ausgleich, created a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary would become two nearly equal partners under a single ruler, Emperor Franz Joseph. Each half would have its own parliament, its own government, and control over most of its internal affairs. Yet they would share certain key institutions, including foreign policy, the military, and financial matters related to these shared responsibilities. On paper, this arrangement appeared balanced, even elegant. It acknowledged Hungary's demands for greater autonomy while preserving the overall structure of the empire. From the outside, it could be seen as a modern solution to an old problem, a way to adapt without collapsing. But beneath that surface, the compromise carried its own limitations. It was, in essence, an agreement between two dominant groups, the Austrian Germans and the Hungarian Magyars. Other nationalities within the empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Romanians, and many more, were not given the same level of recognition or power. Their concerns were largely left unresolved, quietly set aside in order to secure the larger political settlement. This imbalance would not immediately lead to crisis, but it created a structure in which dissatisfaction could grow unevenly. The empire, after 1867, was no longer a single centralized state, yet it was not a federation of equal peoples either. It existed somewhere in between, held together by shared interests and the authority of the emperor, rather than by a unified identity. Even the administrative systems reflected this duality. Laws, policies, and political debates often had to pass through parallel institutions, slowing decision-making and sometimes producing conflicting outcomes. Still, for a time, the arrangement seemed to work. The empire did not fracture. Trade continued, cities developed, and the appearance of stability returned. Vienna remained a center of culture and administration, while Budapest rose in importance as a co-capital. This outward calm, however, depended on a delicate balance that required constant adjustment. Every negotiation, every reform, carried the risk of upsetting that balance. The Compromise of 1867 did not resolve the deeper question of how such a diverse empire could define itself. Instead, it postponed that question, placing it gently in the background where it would continue to shape events in quieter ways. This is where the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Great War begins to reveal its nature not as a unified whole, but as a structure carefully arranged to avoid immediate collapse, even if it could not fully address the forces pulling it apart. If the Compromise of 1867 created a structure that appeared balanced, its daily operation revealed something more complicated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not governed as a single entity, but as two states that shared only what they could not easily separate. Austria, often referred to as Cisleithania, and Hungary, known as Transleithania, developed their own political rhythms, their own priorities, and even their own ways of interpreting the same imperial reality. This division was not merely symbolic. It shaped how laws were written, how policies were enforced, and how people experienced authority in their everyday lives. Each half maintained its own parliament. In Vienna, the Austrian Reichsrat debated issues that affected its territories, while in Budapest, the Hungarian Diet did the same for its lands. These assemblies did not function in isolation, yet they were not fully synchronized either. Matters that concerned the entire empire, such as foreign relations, defense, and certain financial obligations, were handled through joint ministries. These shared institutions required cooperation, but cooperation was not always easy to sustain. Decisions often emerged from negotiation rather than agreement, and negotiation itself could be slow, cautious, and incomplete. This arrangement meant that governance was rarely direct. Instead, it moved through layers of discussion, compromise, and revision. Even something as fundamental as military organization reflected this complexity. While there was a common army, there were also separate territorial forces under Austrian and Hungarian control. Language differences within the military added another layer of difficulty, as orders had to be understood across a wide range of linguistic backgrounds. The system functioned, but it required constant management to prevent misunderstanding. Over time, this created a pattern in which stability depended less on strong central direction and more on the careful maintenance of balance between competing interests. That balance, however, was uneven. Hungary, having secured significant autonomy through the compromise, exercised considerable control over its internal affairs. Within Hungarian lands, policies often favored Magyar identity and language, sometimes at the expense of other groups living there. Austria, by contrast, governed a more fragmented set of regions where no single nationality dominated to the same extent. This difference shaped how each half approached governance. In Hungary, authority could be more centralized within its own domain, while in Austria, political life tended to involve more negotiation among various national groups. The result was not a symmetrical partnership, but a system in which each side faced different internal pressures while still being tied together at the top. Emperor Franz Joseph stood as the unifying figure, holding the titles of both Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. His role was essential, not only as a symbol of continuity, but also as a stabilizing presence in a system that might otherwise drift apart. Yet even his authority had limits. He could not easily override the political arrangements that had been established without risking the delicate equilibrium that kept the empire intact. This meant that many issues were addressed cautiously, if at all. Problems that could not be resolved within the existing framework were often deferred, left to linger rather than confront directly. Seen from a distance, the empire's structure might resemble a carefully constructed mechanism, each part connected to the others in a way that allowed it to function without immediate breakdown. But closer observation reveals that this mechanism relied on constant adjustment. It was not designed to eliminate tension, only to manage it. The dual monarchy created a space where differences could coexist, but it did not provide a clear path toward unity. As a result, the empire moved forward in a state of controlled complexity, stable enough to endure, yet always carrying within it the possibility of strain. This is what made its apparent calm so distinctive before the Great War. It was not the absence of difficulty, but the quiet persistence of a system that could continue operating without fully resolving the questions at its core. What becomes clearer when looking at this system over time is that the dual monarchy did not fail because it was chaotic, but because it was too carefully balanced to adapt quickly. Its strength and its weakness were closely connected. The arrangement created in 1867 was designed to prevent immediate conflict between Austria and Hungary, and in that sense, it succeeded. Decades passed without a fundamental rupture between the two halves, yet this very success made it harder to address deeper structural problems especially those involving the many other peoples within the empire who had not been included in the original compromise. The empire, in effect, had solved one problem by narrowing its focus, and in doing so, it left others to develop more quietly. For groups such as the Czechs in Bohemia, the Croats in the south, or the Romanians in Transylvania, the dual system did not offer an equivalent path to recognition. Their political aspirations did not disappear, they simply found fewer formal channels through which to be expressed. Over time, this created a pattern in which demands for greater autonomy or cultural rights were raised, negotiated, and often postponed. These were not always dramatic confrontations. More often, they unfolded as ongoing disputes over language use in schools, representation in local administrations, or the balance of power within regional governments. Each issue might seem limited on its own, but together they formed a network of tensions that extended across the empire. The dual monarchy structured around the partnership between Austria and Hungary was not well suited to incorporate additional layers of equality without disrupting its original design. Any attempt to grant similar status to another group risked upsetting the balance that had been so carefully constructed. This made reform difficult, not because leaders were unaware of the problems, but because solutions were constrained by the system itself. In this way, the empire's stability depended on maintaining an arrangement that was already incomplete. It could endure, but it could not easily transform. This limitation became more significant as the broader context of Europe began to change. The late 19th century saw the continued rise of nationalist movements, which emphasized the idea that political boundaries should align more closely with cultural and linguistic identities. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this idea did not arrive suddenly. It developed gradually, interacting with local conditions and historical experiences. As these currents strengthened, the gap between the empire's structure and the expectations of its populations became more noticeable. Yet the empire did not collapse under this pressure. Instead, it continued to function, its institutions operating, its cities growing, its administration carrying on its work. This persistence can give the impression that the system was more resilient than it truly was. In reality, resilience came from the ability to delay decisive change rather than to achieve it. The dual monarchy allowed different parts of the empire to coexist without requiring them to fully reconcile their differences. This coexistence, however, depended on a continuous effort to manage tensions without resolving them. By the years leading up to the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood as a structure that had learned how to continue without answering its most fundamental question: how could so many distinct peoples share a single political framework in a way that felt legitimate to all of them? The Compromise of 1867 had provided a temporary answer, one that held for nearly half a century, but it did so by defining the empire as a partnership between two rather than as a union of many. This choice shaped everything that followed. It determined how power was distributed, how conflicts were addressed, and how the empire understood itself. And it meant that, even in its moments of calm, the empire carried within it a quiet uncertainty, not about whether it could continue for now, but about how long such a balance could be maintained without change. If the structure of the empire was built on a compromise between two dominant groups, its population told a very different story. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not defined by a single people, but by a wide and varied collection of communities, each with its own language, traditions, and historical memory. By the late 19th century, this diversity was not hidden or peripheral. It was the central reality of the empire itself. Germans in Austria and Magyars in Hungary held political influence, yet they were surrounded by others whose presence was just as rooted, even if less recognized in the system of power. In the northern regions of Bohemia and Moravia, Czech-speaking populations formed a large and culturally active community. To the east, Slovaks, Ruthenians, and Ukrainians lived across rural landscapes where local identity often mattered more than imperial affiliation. In the south, Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes occupied territories that connected the empire to the broader tensions of the Balkan region. Romanians in Transylvania maintained their own sense of continuity, shaped by language and tradition that extended beyond imperial borders. Italians in the western coastal areas added yet another layer, linking the empire to the shifting politics of the Italian peninsula. This was not simply diversity in numbers, it was diversity in orientation. Different groups looked toward different cultural centers, spoke different languages in daily life, and held different ideas about their place within the empire. In practical terms, this meant that communication itself could become a challenge. Administrative processes, education, and legal systems had to navigate a landscape where language was more than a tool, it was a marker of identity and belonging. In some regions, multiple languages coexisted in close proximity, creating situations where the same space could be experienced in entirely different ways, depending on who lived there. Efforts to standardize language use, especially in official contexts, often carried political implications. Choosing one language over another was not a neutral act. It could signal recognition or exclusion. These decisions, repeated across schools, courts, and local administrations, contributed to a gradual shaping of how different groups perceived their relationship to the state. The empire, therefore, was not only governing territory, but also navigating a complex map of identities that did not easily align with its institutional framework. What made this situation particularly distinctive before the Great War was that it did not immediately result in fragmentation. People continued to live, work, and interact within the imperial system. Markets operated, cities expanded, and cultural life flourished in many areas. Vienna and Budapest, in particular, became centers where multiple influences converged, creating environments that were both cosmopolitan and structured by hierarchy. Yet beneath this ongoing activity, the question of identity remained open. There was no single term, no shared concept that could fully encompass what it meant to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Allegiance to the emperor existed, but it did not replace local or national identities. In many cases, individuals balanced multiple layers of belonging at once, navigating between regional traditions, linguistic communities, and imperial structures. This balance was not inherently unstable, but it required a system capable of accommodating difference without forcing uniformity. The dual monarchy, however, had been designed with a narrower focus, prioritizing the relationship between Austria and Hungary above all others. As a result, the broader diversity of the empire was acknowledged in practice but not fully integrated into its political foundation. This created a situation in which many communities were present within the empire, yet not equally represented in how it defined itself. The absence of a unified identity did not immediately lead to collapse, but it shaped how tensions would emerge and evolve. The empire could continue as long as these differences remained manageable, as long as daily life could proceed without requiring a final answer to the question of who the empire truly belonged to. In this way, the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Great War was not a single cohesive entity, but a layered and shifting mosaic, held together not by uniformity, but by a system that allowed differences to exist side by side, even if it could not fully reconcile them. Language, within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was never only a means of communication. It carried weight, not just in daily conversation, but in law, education, and political life. In a state where so many groups lived side by side, the question of which language to use in official settings became closely tied to the question of whose identity was being recognized. This was not always expressed in direct conflict. More often, it appeared in small, repeated decisions: what language a child learned in school, what language a court used in its proceedings, what language officials chose when addressing the public. Each of these choices, taken individually, might seem administrative. Together, they shaped how different communities experienced their place within the empire. In the Austrian half, where no single nationality held an overwhelming majority, the situation was particularly complex. German was widely used in administration and higher education, reflecting the historical role of Austrian Germans within the imperial system. Yet in regions such as Bohemia, Czech speakers formed a large and active population. Over time, demands grew for Czech to be used more widely in schools and public offices. These demands were not simply about practicality, they were about recognition. To speak one's language in official contexts was to see one's identity acknowledged by the state. As a result, debates over language often became debates over status and equality. Similar patterns could be observed in other parts of the empire. In Galicia, Polish and Ukrainian populations navigated a shared space where language policies could favor one group over another. In the southern territories, the presence of multiple Slavic languages created a landscape in which communication required constant adjustment. These were not isolated cases. Across the empire, language marked the boundaries of community, and those boundaries did not always align with administrative divisions. In the Hungarian half, the approach was more direct, though not necessarily more stable. The Hungarian government placed a strong emphasis on promoting the Magyar language, particularly in education and public administration. This policy aimed to strengthen a sense of unity within Hungary's borders, but it also affected populations who did not identify as Magyar, including Slovaks, Romanians, and Croats. For these groups, the expansion of Hungarian language use could feel less like integration and more like pressure to adapt. The intention was to create cohesion, yet the effect could be to highlight difference more clearly. Over time, language policies contributed to a gradual sharpening of identities. People who might previously have navigated multiple linguistic environments began to associate language more closely with belonging. This did not happen suddenly, nor did it lead to immediate division. Daily life continued, with individuals often speaking several languages depending on context. Markets, workplaces, and neighborhoods remained spaces of interaction. Yet beneath this interaction, the meaning of language was changing. It was becoming a clearer signal of how one related to the state and to other communities within it. The administrative system of the empire had to respond to this reality, but its structure made consistent solutions difficult. Policies that worked in one region could create tension in another. Attempts to standardize often required compromise, and compromise did not always satisfy those involved. As a result, language became an area where the empire's broader challenges were quietly expressed. It revealed how difficult it was to govern a population that did not share a single linguistic or cultural foundation, while also showing how those differences could be managed without immediate breakdown. Before the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire continued to function within this environment. Its institutions adapted, its officials negotiated, and its people adjusted to the conditions around them. Yet the question remained unresolved. Language, in its everyday use, carried the deeper issue of identity: who belonged, how they were recognized, and what place they held within the empire. These questions did not always demand urgent answers, but they remained present, shaping the experience of life within a state that spoke in many voices without ever fully becoming one. If language revealed how people spoke, identity revealed how they understood themselves, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these two did not always align with the structure of the state. There was no widely shared idea of being Austro-Hungarian in the way that other nations began to develop clearer national identities during the 19th century. Loyalty to the emperor existed, and for many it carried a sense of continuity and order, but it did not replace the deeper attachments people felt toward their own communities. A Czech in Prague, a Croat in Zagreb, or a Romanian in Transylvania might all live under the same imperial system, yet their sense of belonging was shaped by different histories, different languages, and different cultural traditions. These identities were not created in opposition to the empire at first. They simply existed alongside it, forming the primary way individuals understood their place in the world. Over time, however, as ideas about nationhood became more influential across Europe, these local and cultural identities began to take on a more political meaning. The question was no longer only who people were, but how that identity should be represented within the structures of power. In an empire that had already defined itself through a compromise between two dominant groups, this question became difficult to answer. The system did not provide a clear model for integrating additional identities at the same level. It recognized diversity in practice, but it did not translate that diversity into a shared political identity that could encompass all its peoples equally. This absence created a subtle but important gap. The empire could function without a unified identity as long as its institutions continued to operate and its populations continued to participate in daily life. Yet without that shared identity, it lacked a unifying narrative that could bind its many parts together beyond administrative necessity. Other states, particularly in Western Europe, were increasingly able to draw on ideas of common language, culture, or historical experience to reinforce a sense of national cohesion. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, by contrast, had to rely on a more abstract form of unity, loyalty to the crown, and the maintenance of a political arrangement that balanced competing interests. This form of unity was real, but it was also limited. It depended on acceptance rather than identification, on coexistence rather than integration. For many within the empire, this arrangement was sufficient for long periods. Life continued, opportunities existed, and the imperial system provided a framework within which different communities could pursue their own paths. Yet when tensions arose, there was no deeper shared identity to absorb or soften them. Instead, differences could become more pronounced as each group interpreted events through its own perspective. This did not mean that conflict was constant or inevitable. The empire, as it moved toward the early 20th century, still held together in a way that suggested durability. Its cities remained active, its cultural life vibrant, and its institutions capable of maintaining order. But beneath this continuity lay an important condition. The empire's unity was maintained without a common sense of belonging that extended equally to all its peoples. It was a structure that allowed many identities to exist within it, yet it did not fully transform those identities into a single, shared framework. This distinction shaped how the empire responded to change. When pressures increased, whether from internal demands or external events, the lack of a unifying identity meant that responses were often negotiated rather than collectively embraced. Each decision had to account for multiple perspectives, each rooted in its own understanding of belonging. In this way, the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Great War can be seen not as a failed attempt at unity, but as a system that operated without fully achieving it. It demonstrated that a state could endure while containing many identities, yet it also showed the limits of such endurance when those identities began to seek a clearer place within the political order. In Vienna, the capital of the Austrian half of the empire, the complexity of the Austro-Hungarian system was not immediately visible. The city presented itself as orderly, elegant, and composed, a place where imperial authority seemed both natural and enduring. Wide boulevards, carefully planned architecture, and a rhythm of daily life shaped by administration and culture all contributed to an atmosphere that suggested stability. Government offices functioned with precision, cultural institutions flourished, and the presence of the imperial court reinforced a sense of continuity that reached back through centuries of Habsburg rule. For those who lived in or visited Vienna, the empire could appear less like a fragile arrangement and more like a well-established structure, quietly confident in its ability to persist. This impression was not entirely misleading. Vienna was, in many ways, the administrative heart of the empire, where decisions were processed, policies drafted, and communication managed across vast distances. The bureaucratic system that operated from the city was extensive, built to handle the needs of a diverse and geographically wide-ranging population. Officials worked within a framework that emphasized procedure, documentation, and gradual adjustment. This approach helped maintain order, allowing the empire to function even when underlying tensions existed elsewhere. From this perspective, Vienna represented the capacity of the state to organize complexity into something manageable. Yet this surface of order also depended on a certain distance from the realities unfolding in other parts of the empire. The issues discussed in offices and ministries often reflected the need to balance competing interests, but they did not always capture the full depth of local experiences. Reports, statistics, and formal debates could translate diverse conditions into a common administrative language, but in doing so, they sometimes simplified the very differences that defined the empire. This was not a deliberate oversight, but a feature of how large systems operate. To govern effectively, complexity had to be structured, categorized, and processed. In Vienna, this process created a sense that the empire's challenges were being addressed, even when solutions remained partial or temporary. Cultural life in the city added another layer to this impression. Vienna, at the turn of the century, was a center of music, art, and intellectual activity. The presence of composers, writers, and thinkers contributed to an environment where creativity and refinement seemed to flourish alongside political administration. This cultural vitality reinforced the image of Vienna as a place where different influences could coexist productively. It suggested that diversity, when brought together under the right conditions, could lead to enrichment rather than division. However, this cultural synthesis was not evenly distributed across the empire. It was concentrated in specific spaces, shaped by access to resources and institutions that were not equally available elsewhere. As a result, the Vienna experience could not fully represent the conditions of the empire as a whole. The city functioned as a center, but the empire extended far beyond it, into regions where daily life followed different patterns, and where the relationship to imperial authority was experienced in more immediate and sometimes more contested ways. This gap between center and periphery did not disrupt the functioning of the state in an obvious way. Communication channels remained open, and the administrative system continued to operate. Yet it introduced a subtle separation between how the empire was perceived at its core and how it was lived at its edges. Vienna could maintain an image of calm and continuity because it processed the empire's complexities at a level of abstraction. It transformed varied realities into forms that could be managed within existing structures. This transformation was essential for governance, but it also meant that the appearance of stability in Vienna did not necessarily reflect the full condition of the empire. Before the Great War, this distinction remained largely contained. The city continued to function as a symbol of order, its institutions operating with consistency, its cultural life maintaining a sense of refinement. But the calm it projected was, in part, a result of how distance and structure shaped perception. The empire could appear stable at its center, even as the forces that defined it were distributed unevenly across its many regions. Within Vienna, the sense of order and refinement was not only maintained by institutions, but also by the daily lives of those who occupied its upper layers of society. The imperial court, aristocratic families, and educated elites formed a social environment that moved at a measured, predictable pace. Their routines attending cultural events, participating in political discussions, managing estates, and engaging in intellectual life reinforced the impression that the empire was functioning as it should. Conversations, often centered on policy, art, or philosophy, framed within a context that assumed continuity rather than disruption. From this vantage point, the empire's complexity could be understood as something to be managed through careful thought and gradual reform, rather than as a source of immediate instability. This perspective was shaped not only by position, but by distance. The elite experience in Vienna was buffered from many of the conditions that defined life in other parts of the empire. Economic disparities, linguistic tensions, and regional grievances were known, but often encountered indirectly through reports, correspondence, or political debate rather than direct experience. As a result, these issues could appear as abstract problems, to be addressed through policy rather than lived as daily realities. This did not mean that those in Vienna were unaware of the empire's challenges. On the contrary, many were deeply engaged in trying to understand and manage them. Yet the framework within which they operated encouraged a certain way of seeing, one that emphasized balance, continuity, and the possibility of gradual adjustment. Beyond Vienna, the experience of the empire could feel quite different. In provincial towns and rural areas, the presence of imperial authority was often more immediate, yet also more limited in scope. Local administrations, schools, and courts were the points at which people interacted with the state, and these interactions were shaped by local conditions as much as by imperial policy. In regions where multiple linguistic or cultural groups lived together, daily life required constant negotiation, not as a matter of theory, but as a practical necessity. The use of language in public spaces, the organization of education, and the distribution of local power all had tangible effects on how communities related to one another and to the state. These experiences did not always align with the more structured understanding of the empire that prevailed in Vienna. Where the center saw complexity to be managed, the periphery often experienced it as a condition to be navigated. This difference in perspective did not necessarily lead to immediate conflict, but it shaped how various parts of the empire responded to change. Policies designed in Vienna could be interpreted differently once they reached local contexts, where historical relationships and social dynamics influenced their implementation. In some cases, adjustments were made to accommodate local needs. In others, tensions emerged when policies did not align with existing conditions. The gap between elite perception and everyday experience was not fixed, but it was persistent. It reflected the broader structure of the empire itself, in which a central authority sought to maintain coherence across a diverse and uneven landscape. The elite in Vienna, through their position, contributed to the maintenance of that coherence. Their belief in the stability of the system was not unfounded, as the empire did continue to function. Yet, that belief was shaped by a perspective that did not fully encompass the range of experiences within the empire. Before the Great War, this difference remained largely contained within the existing structures. Communication, administration, and shared institutions allowed the empire to continue operating despite these variations in perception. Still, the contrast between how the empire was understood at its center and how it was lived in its many regions introduced a quiet tension. It was not a tension that demanded immediate resolution, but one that influenced how problems were recognized and addressed. In this way, Vienna's calm was not simply an illusion, but a partial view, one that reflected the strengths of the imperial system while leaving its more complex realities to unfold elsewhere. What made the calm of Vienna particularly significant was not that it was false, but that it shaped how the empire responded to its own condition. When a system appears stable at its center, the need for urgent change becomes less visible. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this meant that many of the tensions developing across its regions were approached with patience rather than immediacy. The administrative culture of Vienna, with its emphasis on order, procedure, and gradual adjustment, encouraged a style of governance that favored continuity over rapid transformation. Problems were acknowledged, discussed, and often addressed in measured ways, but rarely with the kind of decisive restructuring that might have altered the system more fundamentally. This approach was not without reason. Sudden change in such a complex and diverse empire carried its own risks. Any major reform could shift the balance between Austria and Hungary, or affect the position of other national groups in unpredictable ways. From the perspective of those managing the empire, caution was a form of stability. It allowed the system to continue functioning without triggering new conflicts. Yet this same caution also meant that certain issues were allowed to persist, evolving slowly rather than being resolved. The calm of Vienna, therefore, did not prevent tension. It influenced how tension was handled. It encouraged a belief that time and careful management could maintain equilibrium even when underlying conditions were shifting. In practice, this created a pattern of delayed response. When demands for greater recognition or autonomy emerged from different parts of the empire, they were often met with negotiation, compromise, or partial concessions. These responses could ease immediate pressure, but they did not always address the broader causes of dissatisfaction. Instead, they redistributed tension, moving it from one area to another without fully removing it. Over time, this process contributed to a gradual accumulation of unresolved issues. Each one remained manageable on its own, but together they formed a more complex landscape that required increasing effort to maintain balance. The administrative system in Vienna was capable of handling complexity, but it was less suited to redefining the structure that produced it. This distinction became more important as the empire moved closer to the early 20th century. External pressures, including shifting alliances and rising nationalism across Europe, interacted with the internal dynamics of the empire. These developments did not immediately disrupt the sense of order in Vienna. The city continued to function as it had before, its institutions operating, its cultural life continuing, its political processes unfolding at a measured pace. Yet the conditions surrounding the empire were becoming more dynamic, less predictable. The contrast between a steady center and a changing environment introduced a new kind of challenge, one that required not only management but adaptation. The difficulty lay in recognizing when management was no longer enough. From within Vienna, where stability remained visible, the need for deeper change could appear less urgent than it was elsewhere. This did not mean that leaders were unaware of broader trends. Many were attentive to developments both within and beyond the empire, but awareness did not always translate into action that could alter the system at its core. The structures established in 1867 continued to guide decision-making, shaping what was considered possible or acceptable. As a result, the empire moved forward within a framework that had been designed for an earlier moment, even as conditions gradually shifted around it. Before the Great War, this dynamic did not produce immediate collapse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire remained intact, its institutions functioning, its territories connected through shared systems of governance. Yet the calm at its center had a quiet consequence. It made the empire more capable of continuing as it was, and less prepared to become something different. In this way, the stability of Vienna was both a strength and a limitation, sustaining the empire in the present while narrowing the range of responses available for its future. If Vienna represented the administrative calm of the empire, Budapest revealed a different kind of stability, one that was more assertive, more defined, and shaped by a clearer sense of national direction. After the Compromise of 1867, Hungary did not simply become a partner within the empire, it became a political center with its own ambitions and internal priorities. The Hungarian leadership saw the agreement not only as a resolution to past tensions, but as an opportunity to strengthen its position within the broader imperial structure. This perspective influenced how Hungary governed its territories and how it understood its role alongside Austria. In Budapest, authority was more concentrated in the hands of the Magyar elite, who sought to build a cohesive political identity within the Hungarian half of the empire. Unlike Austria, where multiple national groups competed within a more fragmented system, Hungary pursued a more unified internal structure, at least in principle. This did not mean that diversity was absent. On the contrary, Hungary contained a wide range of populations, including Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and others. But the approach taken by the Hungarian government was to emphasize Magyar language and culture as a central element of governance. This policy was intended to create coherence, to give Hungary a clearer internal identity that could support its position within the dual monarchy. From the perspective of Budapest, this approach offered a form of stability that differed from Vienna's more balanced but diffuse system. Where Austria managed diversity through negotiation among groups, Hungary attempted to shape it through integration into a dominant framework. This difference created a distinct internal dynamic. In Hungary, political life could appear more straightforward, with fewer competing centers of power within its own administration. Decisions could be made with a clearer direction, reflecting the priorities of those who held influence. This did not eliminate tension, but it changed its form. Rather than emerging primarily through negotiation between equal groups, tensions often arose from the relationship between the Magyar center and the non-Magyar populations within its borders. These tensions were not always visible at the highest levels of imperial politics, but they were present in the structure of everyday governance. Budapest itself reflected this sense of emerging strength and identity. The city grew rapidly in the late 19th century, developing into a modern capital that symbolized Hungary's place within the empire. Its architecture, institutions, and public life conveyed confidence, suggesting that Hungary was not merely a subordinate partner, but an active and evolving center of power. This development reinforced the dual nature of the empire. It was not simply one state with a secondary region, but two centers operating in parallel, each with its own logic and priorities. Yet this balance between Vienna and Budapest was not entirely even. While both shared authority at the imperial level, their internal approaches differed in ways that affected the overall coherence of the empire. Austria's system required continuous negotiation among multiple groups, while Hungary's system aimed for internal consolidation under a dominant identity. These contrasting approaches did not cancel each other out. Instead, they coexisted within the broader structure of the dual. The empire, as a result, was not only managing diversity across its territories, but also reconciling two different models of governance within its own framework. Before the Great War, this arrangement continued to function. Vienna and Budapest each maintained their roles, their institutions operating, their political life unfolding within established patterns. The balance between them held, supported by the shared interest in preserving the empire as a whole. Yet this balance depended on the assumption that both centers could continue to operate within their respective approaches without creating contradictions that the imperial system could not absorb. In this way, Budapest did not simply mirror Vienna, it introduced a different way of organizing power within the same empire, shaping how stability was understood and maintained from within. Within the Hungarian half of the empire, the effort to create a more unified political identity did not remove diversity, it reshaped how that diversity was managed. The Hungarian government, led largely by the Magyar elite, pursued policies that emphasized the use of the Hungarian language and the prominence of Magyar culture in public life. This approach was most visible in education, administration, and local governance, where Hungarian increasingly became the expected medium of communication. The intention was not only administrative efficiency, but also the gradual formation of a cohesive national framework within Hungary's borders. From Budapest, this appeared as a logical extension of the autonomy gained in 1867. If Hungary was to function as a strong partner within the empire, it needed a clear internal identity to support that role. Yet the reality on the ground was more complex. The territories governed from Budapest were home to many groups who did not identify as Magyar and whose languages and traditions had long histories of their own. Slovaks in the north, Romanians in Transylvania, Croats in the south, and others lived within a system that increasingly encouraged alignment with a culture that was not originally their own. This did not immediately result in open conflict. In many cases, adaptation occurred gradually, shaped by practical considerations such as access to education or participation in public administration. However, the process was not neutral. It altered the conditions under which different communities could maintain their identity, influencing how they related to the state and to one another. In schools, for example, the language of instruction became a key point of contact between policy and daily life. As Hungarian was promoted more strongly, other languages were sometimes reduced in their official use. For families and communities, this created a situation where participation in the broader system could require a shift in linguistic and cultural orientation. Over time, such changes could accumulate, affecting not only communication, but also the transmission of cultural identity across generations. These developments were often gradual, unfolding over years rather than through sudden measures, which made them less visible at any single moment, but more significant when viewed across a longer period. In local administration, similar patterns emerged. Officials operating within the Hungarian system were expected to function within its linguistic and cultural framework. This could create a distance between authority and population in regions where the majority did not share that framework. Communication still occurred, and governance continued, but the relationship between state and community was shaped by an underlying imbalance. The system did not exclude non-Magyar populations from participation, yet it set conditions that could make full participation more complex. These dynamics contributed to a form of tension that was not always expressed directly. Rather than constant confrontation, there was often a sense of adjustment, communities adapting to policies, officials interpreting regulations within local contexts, and individuals navigating between different expectations. This did not prevent cooperation or coexistence. Daily life, as in other parts of the empire, continued with a degree of continuity that suggested stability. Markets functioned, institutions operated, and social relations adapted to the structures in place. Yet beneath this continuity, the relationship between the Magyar center and the diverse populations it governed remained uneven. The policies that aimed to strengthen Hungary's internal coherence also highlighted the differences they sought to organize. From the perspective of Budapest, this approach was part of building a stronger and more unified state within the empire. From the perspective of many local communities, it could appear as a process that gradually reshaped their position within that state. These two perspectives did not always conflict openly, but they did not fully align either. The result was a form of stability that, like in other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, depended on the management of difference rather than its resolution. Hungary's internal system, while more centralized in its direction, carried within it the same underlying question faced by the empire as a whole: how to sustain a political structure that encompassed multiple identities without fully integrating them into a shared framework. What emerges from this internal arrangement is a form of imbalance that does not immediately break the system, but quietly shapes its limits. Hungary, through its political structure and policies, was able to assert a relatively strong internal coherence compared to many other parts of the empire. Yet this coherence depended on a hierarchy in which the Magyar elite held a central position, while other groups occupied roles that were less influential in shaping the direction of governance. This did not make Hungary unstable in a direct or immediate sense. Its institutions functioned, its administration operated with a clear line of authority, and its role within the dual monarchy remained firmly established. However, the strength of this internal structure did not extend evenly across all who lived within it. For non-Magyar populations, participation in the system often required navigating conditions that did not fully reflect their own identities. Over time, this created a subtle but persistent distance between the governing framework and segments of the population it encompassed. This distance was not always expressed as resistance. In many cases, it appeared as adaptation: communities adjusting to policies, individuals finding ways to work within the system, and local administrations interpreting broader directives in ways that could maintain everyday stability. Yet, adaptation, while allowing continuity, did not necessarily produce alignment. It allowed the system to function without resolving the differences that shaped it. When viewed in isolation, Hungary's internal dynamics might seem manageable, even effective. But within the larger context of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they contributed to a broader pattern of uneven integration. The empire was not only divided between Austria and Hungary, it was also layered with varying degrees of inclusion and influence across its many populations. The dual monarchy had established a partnership at the top, but below that level, the distribution of power remained irregular. Some groups were central to decision-making, while others experienced the system more as something to which they had to adjust. This unevenness did not produce a single, unified point of tension. Instead, it created multiple areas where expectations and realities did not fully align. Each of these areas could be managed individually, through negotiation, compromise, or gradual change. But together, they formed a structure that required continuous effort to maintain balance. The more the system relied on this effort, the more it depended on conditions remaining relatively stable. Any significant shift, whether internal or external, had the potential to affect not just one part of the empire, but the relationships between its many parts. Hungary's position within this structure illustrates a broader characteristic of the empire before the Great War. Stability was achieved not through uniformity, but through a series of arrangements that allowed different regions to function according to their own logic, while still remaining connected at the top. This approach made the empire adaptable in certain ways, capable of accommodating variation without immediate disruption. At the same time, It limited the extent to which deeper integration could occur. The system could hold together, but it did so by maintaining distinctions rather than dissolving them. As a result, the empire's strength was distributed unevenly, and its cohesion depended on the continued alignment of interests among groups that did not share the same position within it. Before 1914, this arrangement remained intact. Hungary continued to operate as a strong partner within the dual monarchy, its internal system reinforcing its role. Yet the conditions that supported this strength also reflected the broader challenge faced by the empire: how to sustain a structure in which different levels of power and recognition coexisted without fully converging. The balance could be maintained, but it required constant adjustment, and it left open the question of how long such an arrangement could continue without encountering pressures it could not absorb. To understand how the Austro-Hungarian Empire functioned on a daily level, it is necessary to look beyond its political agreements and into the structure that translated those agreements into action. The empire was governed through a system that combined shared authority with divided administration, creating a framework that was both intricate and carefully organized. At the center of this system were three joint ministries responsible for foreign affairs, the military, and certain financial matters related to these shared responsibilities. These institutions connected Austria and Hungary at the highest level, ensuring that the empire could act as a single entity in matters that required unity. Yet beyond these shared areas, governance branched into two largely separate systems, each with its own priorities, procedures, and internal challenges. This division meant that administration was not simply complex, it was layered. Decisions that affected the entire empire had to pass through joint structures, where representatives from both halves negotiated their positions. These negotiations were shaped by the need to maintain balance, as neither Austria nor Hungary could dominate the shared institutions without risking the stability of the arrangement. As a result, policy-making at this level often moved with caution. Proposals were discussed, adjusted, and sometimes delayed, not because they lacked importance, but because their implications had to be considered from multiple perspectives. The system was designed to prevent sudden shifts, but in doing so, it also slowed the process of change. Within each half of the empire, the administrative structures developed according to different conditions. In Austria, governance involved managing a highly diverse population with no single dominant group. This required a system that could accommodate variation, often through regional arrangements and negotiated compromises. Local administrations played a significant role, adapting broader policies to fit specific contexts. In Hungary, by contrast, the administrative approach was more centralized, reflecting the emphasis on a cohesive internal identity. These differing methods did not operate in isolation. They existed within the same imperial framework, creating a situation where coordination required not only agreement at the top, but also alignment between systems that functioned in distinct ways. The bureaucracy itself was extensive, composed of officials who worked within clearly defined procedures. Records were kept, regulations followed, and decisions documented with precision. This administrative culture contributed to the empire's ability to maintain order across a wide territory. It provided continuity, ensuring that governance could continue even when political debates remained unresolved. At the same time, it introduced a certain rigidity. Procedures that ensured consistency could also make adaptation more gradual, as changes had to move through established channels before taking effect. This balance between order and flexibility was a defining feature of the system. It allowed the empire to function reliably, but it also meant that responses to new challenges were often measured rather than immediate. Communication across the empire added another dimension to this complexity. Information moved between local administrations, regional authorities, and central institutions, creating a network through which decisions were transmitted and interpreted. This network was effective in maintaining connection, yet it also introduced delays and variations. Policies formulated at the center could be implemented differently depending on local conditions, and feedback from the periphery could take time to influence central decision-making. The result was a system that operated continuously, but not always uniformly. Before the Great War, this administrative structure sustained the empire in a state of functional stability. It managed diversity, coordinated shared responsibilities, and maintained a sense of order across regions that differed significantly from one another. Yet the very features that made this possible, the layered authority, the reliance on negotiation, and the emphasis on procedure, also shaped the limits of what the system could achieve. It was well suited to maintaining continuity, but less suited to rapid transformation. In this way, the governance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire reflected its broader character, a structure capable of enduring complexity, but dependent on a careful balance that required constant attention to maintain. If the structure of governance required cooperation, then decision-making required something even more difficult: sustained agreement between two political centers that did not always move in the same direction. Austria and Hungary, though bound together within the dual monarchy, approached many issues from perspectives shaped by their own internal conditions. This meant that when decisions had to be made at the imperial level, they were rarely straightforward. Instead, they became processes of alignment, where each side sought to protect its own interests while maintaining the overall balance that kept the system intact. This dynamic was especially visible in areas managed by the joint ministries. Questions of foreign policy, military organization, and shared financial obligations could not be resolved unilaterally. They required coordination, and coordination required negotiation. Representatives from both halves of the empire had to reach an understanding that would be acceptable within their respective political environments. This often meant that proposals were adjusted repeatedly, shaped by concerns that extended beyond the immediate issue at hand. A decision that seemed efficient in one context might be viewed as problematic in another, not because of its content alone, but because of how it affected the broader equilibrium between Austria and Hungary. The result was a style of decision-making that favored caution. Agreements were possible, but they were often the product of careful compromise rather than decisive direction. This approach helped prevent conflict at the highest level, yet it also introduced delays. Time became an essential part of the process, allowing positions to be reconsidered and tensions to be managed. However, time also meant that responses to changing conditions could lag behind the pace at which those conditions evolved. What was appropriate at one moment might become less effective as circumstances shifted, but the structure of the system made rapid adjustment difficult. Within each half of the empire, these delays could be interpreted differently. In Austria, where governance already involved balancing multiple national groups, the need for negotiation at the imperial level was consistent with the broader political culture. It reinforced an existing pattern in which decisions emerged through discussion and compromise. In Hungary, where internal governance was more centralized, delays at the imperial level could be seen as constraints on a system that otherwise operated with clearer direction. This difference in perception did not necessarily lead to open disagreement, but it influenced how each side approached the process of joint decision-making. Over time, it contributed to a subtle divergence in expectations. What one side viewed as necessary caution, the other might experience as limitation. Financial arrangements further illustrated this complexity. The shared costs of the empire, particularly those related to the military and foreign policy, had to be renegotiated periodically between Austria and Hungary. These negotiations were not merely technical, they reflected broader questions about responsibility, influence, and the distribution of resources. Each renegotiation became an opportunity to reassess the terms of cooperation, and while agreements were consistently reached, the process itself underscored the conditional nature of the partnership. The empire functioned through ongoing consent rather than fixed unity. This did not make the system unstable in an immediate sense. On the contrary, it demonstrated a capacity to manage differences without breaking apart. Yet it also meant that stability depended on the continued willingness of both sides to engage in this process. Decision-making was not only about choosing a course of action, but about reaffirming the relationship that made such decisions possible. In this context, delays were not simply inefficiencies, they were part of how the system maintained balance. Before the Great War, this method of governance allowed the Austro-Hungarian Empire to continue operating across a wide range of conditions. Its institutions remained active, its policies implemented, and its structure preserved. However, the same processes that enabled this continuity also defined its limits. When faced with situations that required swift, unified responses, the need for alignment could become a constraint. The empire could act, but it often did so at a pace shaped by negotiation rather than urgency, reflecting a system designed to endure complexity rather than to resolve it quickly. Over time, the consequences of this method of governance became more apparent, not through sudden failure, but through the way the empire responded to increasing pressure. A system built on negotiation and balance could manage gradual change, but it was less prepared for moments that required clarity and speed. As long as challenges developed slowly, the administrative structure could absorb them, distributing their impact across its many layers. But when conditions began to shift more quickly, both within the empire and beyond it, the limits of this approach became more visible. The difficulty was not that the empire could not act, but that it struggled to act with the kind of unified direction that more centralized states could sometimes achieve. Each decision at the imperial level still required alignment between Austria and Hungary, and that alignment took time. In periods of relative stability, this was manageable. In periods of uncertainty, it could become a constraint. Issues that demanded immediate attention had to move through the same processes as those that could unfold more gradually. This created a situation where the pace of response did not always match the pace of events. The empire continued to function, but it did so within a framework that was not designed for rapid adjustment. This mismatch did not always produce visible disruption. In many cases, the existing system could continue operating even as conditions changed around it. Local administrations adapted, officials interpreted policies in ways that maintained order, and daily life proceeded with a sense of continuity. Yet beneath this surface, the gap between the demands placed on the system and its capacity to respond began to widen. Each delay, each partial solution, contributed to a gradual accumulation of unresolved pressures. These pressures were not concentrated in a single area. They appeared across different parts of the empire, shaped by local conditions, but connected through the broader structure of governance. External developments added another layer to this dynamic. As Europe moved toward the early 20th century, political alliances shifted, and the balance of power between states became more fluid. These changes required responses that were not only measured, but also timely. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, responding to such developments involved the same processes of negotiation and coordination that governed internal affairs. Foreign policy decisions, military planning, and diplomatic actions all had to be aligned within the dual structure. This did not prevent the empire from engaging with the wider European context, but it influenced how quickly and decisively it could do so. The need to maintain internal balance remained a constant factor, shaping the range of actions that could be taken at any given moment. This interaction between internal structure and external pressure created a subtle tension. The empire's strength lay in its ability to continue functioning despite complexity. Its limitation lay in how that complexity constrained its responses when conditions required more immediate change. Over time, this meant that the system relied increasingly on its capacity to manage rather than to transform. It could address individual issues, adjust policies, and maintain order, but it found it more difficult to redefine its overall direction in response to shifting circumstances. Before the Great War, this condition did not lead to immediate collapse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire remained intact, its institutions active, its governance ongoing, yet its ability to respond effectively was shaped by the very structure that had allowed it to endure. The processes that ensured balance also limited speed, and the emphasis on continuity reduced the likelihood of fundamental change. In this way, the empire moved forward with a form of stability that was both real and constrained, capable of sustaining the present, but less equipped to adapt fully to a future that was becoming increasingly uncertain. By the late 19th century, a quiet shift was taking place across Europe, one that did not always announce itself through immediate upheaval, but gradually altered how people understood their place in the world. This shift was the rise of nationalism not as a sudden force, but as a developing idea that connected language, culture, and political belonging in new ways. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this idea did not arrive from outside as something entirely foreign. It grew within the empire itself, shaped by the very diversity that defined it. Communities that had long maintained their own traditions began to see those traditions not only as cultural inheritance, but as the foundation for political identity. This change in perspective did not happen all at once. It emerged slowly, often through education, literature, and local movements that sought to preserve language and history. At first, these efforts were not necessarily directed against the empire. They focused on recognition, on ensuring that a community's identity could be maintained within the existing system. Yet over time, the distinction between cultural expression and political aspiration became less clear. To ask for recognition of language in schools or representation in local administration was also to ask how power should be distributed. In this way, nationalism developed not as a single unified movement, but as a series of parallel currents, each shaped by the experiences of different groups within the empire. In Bohemia, Czech intellectuals and political leaders worked to strengthen the use of their language and assert their historical presence within the region. In the southern territories, South Slavic communities navigated a complex environment influenced both by imperial structures and by developments in the Balkans. In Transylvania, Romanian populations engaged with ideas that connected them to broader cultural and linguistic traditions beyond the empire's borders. These movements did not follow a single pattern, nor did they share identical goals. Some sought greater autonomy within the empire, while others began to imagine more fundamental changes. What they shared was a growing sense that identity should be reflected more directly in political arrangements. The Austro-Hungarian system, however, had been designed around a different principle. It recognized diversity in practice, but it did not fully incorporate the idea that each national group might seek its own form of political expression. The Compromise of 1867 had addressed the relationship between Austria and Hungary, but it had not established a model for how other identities might be integrated at the same level. As nationalism developed, this absence became more noticeable. The empire could accommodate cultural expression to a certain extent, but when those expressions began to carry political implications, the system faced a more complex challenge. Responses to these developments were varied. In some cases, local authorities allowed greater use of regional languages or supported cultural institutions. In others, efforts were made to maintain existing structures, limiting changes that might disrupt the balance of power. These responses were not coordinated in a single direction. They reflected the broader nature of the empire itself, where different regions and administrations approached similar issues in different ways. This lack of uniformity did not immediately lead to instability. On the contrary, it allowed the empire to continue functioning by adapting to local conditions, yet it also meant that nationalism was not addressed as a single, unified phenomenon. Instead, it was managed in parts, each adjustment responding to a specific situation without fully resolving the underlying trend. As a result, nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire developed quietly, embedded in the daily life of its populations. It did not always appear as open opposition, but as a gradual redefinition of belonging. People continued to live within the empire, participate in its institutions, and engage with its systems. At the same time, they began to see themselves more clearly as members of distinct communities whose identity carried political meaning. This dual experience living within the empire while imagining new forms of belonging became one of the defining conditions of the period before the Great War. It did not immediately disrupt the empire's structure, but it introduced a force that operated alongside it, shaping how its future would be understood. As these movements developed, a gradual shift began to take place, one that was not immediately visible, but changed the nature of what people were asking for. What had begun as efforts to preserve language, literature, and cultural traditions increasingly took on a political dimension. Schools that once focused on teaching in a native language became places where identity was reinforced more consciously. Newspapers and publications, written in local languages, did more than inform. They shaped how communities understood their history and their place within the empire. Over time, this process transformed cultural awareness into something more structured, more intentional. It became a way of organizing collective expectations. The distinction between cultural recognition and political representation began to fade. When a community sought the right to use its language in administration, it was also asking who held authority. When it asked for greater representation in local government, it was questioning how power was distributed. These were not necessarily demands for separation, but they moved beyond the framework that the empire had been designed to manage. The dual monarchy could accommodate difference to a certain degree, but it had not been built to reorganize itself around multiple, equally recognized national identities. As a result, the system found itself responding to questions it was not fully structured to answer. In different regions, this shift unfolded in distinct ways. In Bohemia, Czech political leaders moved from cultural revival toward demands for greater autonomy within the imperial system, seeking a status that would more closely reflect their demographic and historical presence. In the southern territories, South Slavic groups engaged with ideas that extended beyond the empire, influenced by neighboring states and broader regional dynamics. These connections did not automatically lead to unified movements, but they introduced new possibilities, new ways of imagining political belonging that were not confined to the existing imperial framework. In Hungary, similar developments occurred among non-Magyar populations, where cultural identity became increasingly linked to questions of rights and recognition within the state. What connected these different developments was not a single coordinated effort, but a shared transformation in how identity was understood. It was no longer only something to be preserved, it became something to be represented. This change placed new pressure on the structures of the empire. The administrative system could process requests, negotiate adjustments, and maintain order, but it could not easily redefine the principles on which it operated. Each concession, each reform, had to be balanced against the existing arrangement between Austria and Hungary. Expanding recognition for one group could raise questions for others, creating a chain of considerations that extended beyond the original issue. This made responses cautious and often partial. Solutions addressed immediate concerns, but they rarely resolved the broader shift that was taking place. Over time, this created a situation in which expectations and possibilities began to diverge. Communities developed clearer ideas about how they wished to be represented, while the imperial system continued to function within a framework that limited how far those ideas could be implemented. This divergence did not produce immediate confrontation. Life within the empire continued, institutions operated, and many individuals navigated these changes without direct conflict. Yet the direction of change had altered. National movements were no longer only about maintaining identity within the empire. They were beginning to explore how that identity might shape political structures more directly. The empire, in turn, continued to respond through negotiation and adaptation, maintaining stability while gradually encountering questions that extended beyond its original design. Before the Great War, this process remained incomplete. The transformation from cultural awareness to political aspiration had begun, but it had not yet reached a point of final resolution. Instead, it existed as an ongoing development, one that unfolded across regions and communities, shaping the conditions under which the empire would continue to operate. In this way, nationalism did not immediately break the system, but it changed the terms on which the system was understood, introducing a quiet shift that the existing structures could manage only in part. As these political aspirations became more defined, the ability of the empire to manage them in the same gradual way began to weaken. What had once been a series of local adjustments, language rights here, administrative reforms there now started to connect into broader patterns. Communities were no longer only responding to immediate conditions, they were increasingly aware of similar movements elsewhere within the empire. This awareness did not require coordination to have an effect. It created a sense that their experiences were part of something larger, a shared process in which identity and political structure were becoming more closely linked. The empire, which had long managed diversity by addressing issues individually, now faced developments that extended across regions and could not be contained within a single administrative response. This shift did not produce a single moment of crisis. Instead, it altered the conditions under which governance operated. The system continued to function, but its methods became less effective in addressing the kinds of questions being raised. When demands were primarily cultural, they could often be accommodated without altering the broader structure. When those demands became political, they began to challenge the distribution of power itself. Each request for greater autonomy or recognition carried implications that reached beyond the local level, touching on the balance between Austria and Hungary and on the position of other groups within the empire. This made responses more complex, as any change had to be considered within an increasingly interconnected framework of interests. The empire's reliance on negotiation, which had once been a source of stability, now became more difficult to sustain. Negotiation depends on the possibility of compromise, on the idea that different sides can reach an agreement that preserves the overall system. As national movements developed clearer goals, the space for compromise began to narrow. Some groups still sought greater autonomy within the empire, but others began to imagine arrangements that extended beyond it. These ideas did not always translate into immediate action, yet they influenced how negotiations were approached. If the desired outcome was no longer fully contained within the existing structure, then adjustments within that structure could feel incomplete. This did not mean that cooperation disappeared. Many political leaders continued to engage with imperial institutions, seeking solutions that could work within the system. But the underlying direction had changed. The empire was no longer only managing differences among its populations, it was encountering movements that were redefining what those differences meant in political terms. This redefinition made it more difficult to rely on the methods that had previously maintained balance. Administrative processes could still operate, laws could still be enforced, and daily life could continue with a degree of continuity. Yet the alignment between the system and the expectations of its populations was becoming less certain. In practical terms, this created a form of instability that was not immediately visible. There was no single point at which the system failed, no clear moment when its structures ceased to function. Instead, there was a gradual shift in how those structures were experienced. They remained in place, but their ability to fully represent the evolving identities within the empire was increasingly limited. This limitation did not lead directly to collapse, but it shaped how the empire would respond to future pressures. By the years before the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had entered a condition in which its mechanisms of stability were still active, but the context in which they operated had changed. National movements had moved beyond being elements within the system to becoming forces that interacted with it in more complex ways. The empire could still manage many aspects of its internal life, but it was now doing so in an environment where the terms of belonging and authority were being reconsidered. This did not yet produce a final outcome. It created a situation in which the empire continued to function, even as the foundations of how it understood itself were quietly shifting, introducing a tension that would shape the path ahead without yet determining its conclusion. At first glance, the military of the Austro-Hungarian Empire appeared to be one of its most unifying institutions. It was, after all, a shared structure, one of the few areas where Austria and Hungary operated together under a common command. Soldiers from across the empire served under the same emperor, wore similar uniforms, and were organized within a system that, in theory, represented the collective strength of all its territories. In a state defined by division, in many other areas, the army seemed to offer a point of cohesion, a place where differences could be set aside in favor of a shared purpose. Yet this appearance of unity, like so many aspects of the empire, depended on how closely one looked. The military was not a single uniform body, but a layered institution that reflected the broader structure of the dual monarchy. Alongside the common army, there existed separate forces, the Austrian Landwehr and the Hungarian Honved. These parallel institutions were tied to their respective halves of the empire, each with its own administration and internal identity. While they could be coordinated in times of need, their existence underscored the fact that even in matters of defense, the empire was not fully unified. This arrangement was a direct extension of the Compromise of 1867, which had preserved shared responsibility while maintaining internal distinction. Within the common army itself, diversity was not only present, it was unavoidable. Soldiers came from a wide range of linguistic and cultural backgrounds, bringing with them different ways of understanding authority, duty, and belonging. Orders had to be communicated across multiple languages, and while German often served as the primary language of command, it was not universally understood at the same level by all who served. This did not make the army ineffective, but it introduced an additional layer of complexity into its daily operation. Training, coordination, and discipline required not only standard procedures, but also an awareness of the differences that shaped how those procedures were received. Officers, in particular, played a crucial role in maintaining cohesion within this environment. They were expected to navigate linguistic diversity, manage units composed of soldiers from different regions, and uphold a sense of shared purpose that extended beyond local identities. This was not always a straightforward task. Loyalty to the emperor provided a unifying element, but it coexisted with other forms of identification that did not disappear within the structure of the army. A soldier might serve under the same flag as others from distant parts of the empire, yet still retain a strong connection to his own community, language, and traditions. The military system did not eliminate these connections, it operated alongside them. In many ways, the army reflected the broader condition of the empire itself. It was a structure designed to bring together different elements without fully merging them into a single identity. This approach could function effectively under stable conditions, where coordination and discipline were sufficient to maintain order. The army trained, organized, and prepared for its role, and it did so with a degree of consistency that suggested reliability. Yet the underlying diversity remained a constant factor, shaping how the institution operated at every level. Before the Great War, this complexity did not prevent the military from fulfilling its duties. It stood as a symbol of imperial strength, its presence reinforcing the idea that, despite internal differences, the empire could act as a unified power when necessary. At the same time, the very structure that allowed for this appearance of unity also reflected the limits of integration within the empire. The army could bring people together under a common command, but it did not fully resolve the differences they carried with them. In this way, it embodied the same balance seen throughout the Austro-Hungarian system, a balance that allowed for cooperation without complete unity, maintaining stability while leaving deeper questions of identity quietly in place. Within this shared military structure, language was not simply a matter of communication, it shaped how authority was understood and how coordination was carried out in practice. The Austro-Hungarian army operated across a landscape of many languages, and while German was generally used as the primary language of command, it was not equally familiar to all soldiers. Recruits often entered service speaking their local language, Czech, Hungarian, Polish, Croatian, Romanian, or others, and their ability to understand commands depended on both training and exposure. This created a situation where communication required constant adjustment, especially at the level of everyday interaction. Orders could be issued clearly from above, yet their interpretation, at lower levels, sometimes depended on translation, repetition, or the presence of officers who could bridge linguistic gaps. This did not make the army ineffective, but it introduced a degree of variation into processes that relied on precision. The structure of command attempted to account for this diversity. Units were often organized in ways that grouped soldiers from similar regions, allowing for some linguistic consistency within smaller formations. Officers were expected to learn key phrases or commands in the languages of those they led, and manuals sometimes included multiple language versions. These adaptations reflected an awareness of the empire's diversity, as well as an effort to manage it within the framework of a unified military system. Yet even with these measures, language remained a factor that shaped how cohesion was experienced. It influenced not only how orders were followed, but also how soldiers related to one another and to the institution they served. Alongside language, the question of loyalty carried its own complexity. Soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army swore allegiance to the emperor, and this oath provided a central point of unity. For many, this loyalty was genuine and meaningful, rooted in a long-standing tradition of imperial service. At the same time, it existed alongside other forms of attachment that were closer to daily life, family, region, and community. These connections did not disappear when a soldier entered the army. They remained present, shaping how individuals understood their role within a larger structure. In stable conditions, these multiple layers of loyalty could coexist without conflict. A soldier could serve the empire while maintaining a strong sense of local identity, without feeling that the two were incompatible. However, the coexistence of these loyalties depended on the assumption that they would not be placed in direct tension with one another. The military system functioned effectively as long as its demands aligned with the broader sense of order that existed within the empire. Training, discipline, and shared routines reinforced a common framework, allowing soldiers from different backgrounds to operate together. Yet this framework did not fully transform individual identity into a single unified form. Instead, it created a space where different identities could function side by side, coordinated through structure rather than merged through shared belonging. This distinction was subtle but important. It meant that cohesion was achieved through organization and procedure rather than through a deeply internalized sense of unity. Over time, this had implications for how the army could respond to situations that required not only coordination, but also a shared sense of purpose. Before the Great War, these conditions remained largely manageable. The army trained, prepared, and maintained its role within the empire, its internal complexities handled through established practices. Communication systems worked, loyalties held, and the institution continued to function as a central element of imperial stability. Yet beneath this functioning system, the same pattern seen elsewhere in the empire was present. Unity existed, but it was structured rather than organic. It depended on the careful alignment of many parts, each carrying its own identity, each operating within a framework that allowed cooperation without fully dissolving difference. In this way, the military did not stand apart from the broader condition of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It reflected it, shaped by the same balance between diversity and cohesion that defined the system as a whole. When considered in times of peace, this structure could appear sufficient, even effective. Training routines, hierarchical command, and established procedures allowed the army to operate with a degree of reliability that reinforced the empire's sense of stability. Yet the conditions of peace did not place the same demands on the military as those of war. In a controlled environment, complexity could be managed, differences accommodated, and coordination maintained through repetition and structure. The true test of such a system lay not in its ability to function under stable conditions, but in how it would respond when those conditions changed, when speed, clarity, and unified purpose became essential. The Austro-Hungarian army, shaped by the broader characteristics of the empire, carried within it a form of cohesion that depended on organization rather than complete internal alignment. This distinction was not immediately visible, but it became more significant when considering how the army might act under pressure. In situations that required rapid movement and clear communication, the need to translate orders across linguistic boundaries could introduce delays or variations in understanding. These were not constant or predictable disruptions, but possibilities that existed within the system. The structure had been designed to accommodate diversity, not to eliminate it, and this meant that coordination relied on continuous effort rather than automatic unity. At the same time, The layered nature of the military divided between the common army and the separate forces of Austria and Hungary reflected the political structure of the empire itself. While these forces could be brought together, their existence as distinct entities suggested that unity was conditional, shaped by circumstances rather than fully embedded in the system. In moments that required collective action, this arrangement depended on the successful alignment of multiple components, each with its own administrative and cultural background. This alignment was possible, but it required coordination at a level that extended beyond routine operations. The question was not whether the army could function, but how efficiently it could respond when faced with situations that demanded immediate and unified action. Loyalty, too, took on a different dimension under such conditions. In everyday service, allegiance to the emperor and adherence to military discipline provided a stable foundation. Yet in moments of uncertainty or conflict, the presence of multiple layers of identity could become more pronounced. Soldiers who had long balanced their role within the imperial structure with their connection to local communities might find those layers interacting in new ways. This did not imply a breakdown of loyalty, but it introduced a complexity into how loyalty was experienced and expressed. The army's cohesion, built on structure and routine, could be maintained, but it was not entirely independent of the broader social and cultural context from which its soldiers came. What emerges from this perspective is not a picture of weakness in the immediate sense, but of limitation shaped by structure. The Austro-Hungarian military was capable, organized, and integrated into the functioning of the empire. It fulfilled its role within a system that valued balance and continuity. At the same time, it reflected the same underlying condition as the empire itself, a reliance on coordination among diverse elements that did not fully merge into a single identity. This reliance was sustainable under conditions where time and procedure allowed differences to be managed. It became more challenging in situations that required speed, clarity, and a unified sense of direction. Before the Great War, this distinction remained largely theoretical, embedded in the structure rather than tested by its most demanding conditions. The army stood as a central institution of the empire, reinforcing its presence and its capacity to act. Yet the nature of its cohesion suggested that its effectiveness depended not only on its organization, but on the environment in which it operated. In this way, the military did not stand apart from the broader questions facing the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It carried them within its own structure, shaped by the same balance between unity and difference that defined the system as a whole. Economic life within the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not follow a single pattern. Like its political and social structure, it was shaped by contrast between regions that developed rapidly and those that remained more traditional in their organization. By the late 19th century, certain parts of the empire, particularly in Austria and areas like Bohemia, had become centers of industry. Factories, railways, and urban growth transformed these regions, connecting them more closely to wider European markets. Cities expanded, new forms of work emerged, and economic activity began to move at a different pace than it had in earlier decades. This process created opportunities, drawing people into industrial centers and linking local economies to broader systems of trade and production. Vienna, as the administrative and cultural center, also functioned as an economic hub where finance, commerce, and industry intersected. Budapest, too, experienced significant growth, reflecting Hungary's increasing role within the empire. These developments gave the impression of an empire that was modernizing, adapting to the changes of the time. Yet this impression was only part of the picture. Beyond these more developed regions, large areas of the empire remained primarily agricultural. In Galicia, parts of Transylvania, and other eastern and southern regions, economic life was still centered on farming, local markets, and traditional forms of production. Infrastructure developed more slowly, and access to industrial opportunities was limited. For many people living in these areas, daily life changed at a different pace, shaped more by seasonal rhythms than by the expanding networks of industry. This contrast between industrial and agricultural regions did not immediately create instability, but it introduced a difference in experience that paralleled the empire's other divisions. Those living in more industrialized areas encountered new forms of work, education, and social organization, while those in rural regions remained connected to older patterns of life. These differences influenced not only economic conditions, but also how people understood their relationship to the state. In more developed regions, the presence of industry and infrastructure could make the empire feel more immediate, more integrated into daily life. In less developed areas, that connection could feel more distant, shaped by local conditions rather than by direct engagement with imperial systems. The administrative structure of the empire attempted to manage this variation, supporting development where possible while maintaining overall stability. Railways expanded, linking regions and facilitating movement of goods and people. Trade networks grew, connecting different parts of the empire to one another and to external markets. These efforts contributed to a sense of cohesion, suggesting that despite its diversity, the empire functioned as an interconnected economic space. However, development did not occur evenly, and the pace of change varied across regions. This unevenness was not always the result of deliberate policy. It reflected geography, historical patterns, and the distribution of resources, all of which shaped how different areas evolved over time. Before the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire continued to function within this economic landscape. Its industries expanded, its agricultural regions sustained large populations, and its trade networks maintained connections across its territories. Yet the contrasts remained, quietly shaping the conditions under which people lived and worked. The empire's economic life, like its political and social structure, was not uniform. It was a system in which different regions moved at different speeds, connected by shared frameworks but defined by distinct experiences. This did not disrupt the empire's functioning, but it introduced another layer of complexity, one that would influence how stability was maintained and how change would be felt across its many parts. As these economic differences became more established, they began to shape not only how people lived, but how they understood fairness within the empire. In regions where industry expanded and infrastructure improved, opportunities for work and mobility increased. Wages, though often modest, were connected to a growing economy that offered pathways, however limited, into new forms of life. Cities became places where individuals could move beyond traditional roles, where education and employment created possibilities that did not exist in the same way in rural areas. This did not mean that industrial regions were free of hardship. Working conditions could be difficult, and social inequalities remained present. Yet the presence of change itself created a sense that movement, however gradual, was possible. In contrast, in the more agricultural regions of the empire, such movement was less visible. Economic life remained tied to land, local markets, and long-standing social structures. Opportunities for advancement were more limited, and the benefits of industrial growth did not always reach these areas with the same intensity. Infrastructure developed more slowly, and access to education or diversified employment could depend heavily on location. For those living in these regions, the empire's broader economic development might appear distant, something that existed elsewhere rather than as part of their immediate experience. This contrast did not always produce direct conflict, but it introduced a growing awareness of difference. People could observe, through travel, communication, or reports, that other parts of the empire were changing in ways that their own regions were not. This awareness did not necessarily lead to immediate demands, but it shaped expectations. Over time, it contributed to a sense that the distribution of opportunity was uneven, that the benefits of belonging to a large and diverse empire were not experienced equally by all its populations. Economic inequality, in this context, was not only about income or resources, it was about access to education, to infrastructure, to the networks that connected different parts of the empire. These forms of access influenced how individuals and communities related to the state. In regions where development was more visible, the empire could be seen as a source of connection and growth. In regions where change was slower, the relationship could feel more distant, shaped by local conditions rather than by a direct sense of participation in a larger system. The administrative structure of the empire recognized these differences, but addressing them fully was difficult. Policies aimed at development had to operate within the same complex framework that governed other aspects of the empire. Resources were allocated, projects undertaken, but the scale of variation meant that change was uneven. Efforts to improve infrastructure or expand economic activity could have significant effects in some areas while leaving others relatively unchanged. This did not indicate neglect so much as the challenge of managing a territory where conditions varied so widely. Over time, these economic patterns began to interact with other aspects of the empire's structure. Regions that experienced slower development were often also those where national identities were strongly maintained, where local languages and traditions remained central to daily life. In such contexts, economic inequality could become connected to broader questions of recognition and representation. The experience of limited opportunity could be interpreted not only in economic terms, but as part of a wider pattern in which certain groups felt less integrated into the structures of power. This connection was not always explicit, but it influenced how different communities understood their position within the empire. Before the Great War, these conditions remained part of the empire's ongoing reality. Economic life continued, trade networks functioned, and development progressed, even if unevenly. The empire did not fragment under the weight of these differences. Instead, it adapted, maintaining a system in which varied experiences could coexist. Yet the contrasts persisted, shaping perceptions in ways that extended beyond economics alone. They contributed to a quiet sense that while the empire connected many regions, it did not do so in a way that felt equal to all who lived within it. As these economic contrasts deepened, they did not remain isolated within the sphere of material life. Instead, they began to intersect with the empire's existing divisions of language, identity, and political representation. What had once been differences in development gradually took on a broader meaning, shaping how communities interpreted their place within the imperial system. In regions where economic opportunities were limited, this condition was not always seen as a natural outcome of geography or history. It could also be understood through the lens of identity, who held influence, whose interests were prioritized, and how decisions were made at levels that felt distant from everyday life. This interpretation did not emerge all at once, nor did it lead immediately to organized opposition. Rather, it developed as part of a gradual shift in perception, where economic experience became connected to questions of recognition and inclusion. For communities that already felt underrepresented within the political structure, slower economic development could reinforce a sense of separation. The issue was not only that opportunities were uneven, but that this unevenness appeared to align with existing patterns of power. Regions dominated by certain groups seemed to benefit more from industrial growth and infrastructure, while others remained more peripheral to these changes. Whether this perception fully reflected the complexity of policy and circumstance was less important than the fact that it shaped how people understood their situation. Over time, these perceptions contributed to a broader narrative in which economic conditions were seen as part of a larger imbalance within the empire. This interaction between economics and identity created a form of pressure that was not always visible in political debates, but present in how communities responded to change. When new policies were introduced, or when discussions of reform took place, they were interpreted not only in terms of their immediate effects, but also in relation to existing inequalities. A proposal that aimed to improve infrastructure in one region might be viewed differently elsewhere, not because of its content alone, but because of how it fit into a wider pattern of development. In this way, economic decisions became linked to questions of trust, whether the system could distribute its benefits in a way that felt balanced across its many populations. The administrative structure of the empire continued to manage these conditions through the same methods it applied elsewhere: negotiation, gradual adjustment, and localized responses. These methods allowed the system to function, preventing differences from escalating into immediate crisis. Yet they did not fully address the way economic inequality had begun to interact with other forms of division. Each issue could be managed individually, but together they formed a more interconnected set of pressures. Economic disparity was no longer only about resources, it was about how those resources related to identity, representation, and belonging within the empire. This made the situation more complex, as solutions in one area could have implications in another. Efforts to promote development, for example, had to consider not only practical outcomes, but also how those outcomes would be perceived across different communities. Before the Great War, the empire continued to operate within this environment. Its economy functioned, its regions remained connected, and its institutions maintained order. There was no immediate breakdown, no single moment where these pressures became unmanageable. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of conditions that influenced how stability was experienced. The empire could still sustain itself, but it did so in a context where economic, cultural, and political differences were increasingly intertwined. This did not yet determine a clear outcome. It created a situation in which the empire's ability to endure depended on its capacity to manage not just individual challenges, but the relationships between them, relationships that were becoming more intricate as the forces shaping them continued to evolve. At the edges of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the patterns that had developed within its core took on a different intensity. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Balkan region, where the empire's internal complexities met a wider landscape of shifting political forces. This was not simply another peripheral area. It was a space where identities, borders, and ambitions extended beyond the empire itself, connecting local conditions to broader movements that were unfolding across southeastern Europe. In this environment, the balance that the empire had maintained within its own territories encountered influences that it could not fully control. Bosnia and Herzegovina, in particular, occupied a central place in this dynamic. Administered by Austria-Hungary after 1878 and formally annexed in 1908, the region brought into the empire a population with its own complex composition of religious and cultural identities, Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim communities living within a shared but layered history. The administration of Bosnia required the empire to extend its system into a context that differed from its established regions. Governance had to account not only for internal diversity, but also for the proximity of neighboring states and the presence of ideas that crossed imperial boundaries. Serbia, just beyond the empire's southern border, represented one of the most significant of these external influences. As an independent state with its own national aspirations, Serbia became a point of reference for South Slavic populations within and near the empire. This connection was not uniform or always direct, but it introduced an additional dimension to how identity was understood in the region. The idea that political structures could align more closely with cultural or linguistic communities was not confined within imperial borders. It moved across them, shaping expectations in ways that the empire's internal systems had not been designed to accommodate. From Vienna and Budapest, the Balkan region required careful management. It was an area where internal administration and external policy could not be separated easily. Decisions made within the empire had implications beyond it, and developments outside its borders could influence conditions within. This created a situation in which the empire's established methods, negotiation, gradual adjustment, and balance had to operate in a more fluid and less predictable environment. The annexation of Bosnia in 1908 illustrated this complexity. While it was a formal extension of imperial authority, it also altered the relationship between the empire and its neighbors, introducing new tensions into an already sensitive region. These tensions did not immediately lead to conflict. The empire continued to govern Bosnia, integrating it into its administrative framework while maintaining order. Yet, the conditions in the region differed from those in the core of the empire. Here, identity was not only a matter of internal organization, but part of a broader regional context where different states and movements interacted. This meant that the empire's presence was experienced not only as governance, but also as part of a larger set of relationships that extended beyond its control. For the populations living in these areas, daily life continued within the structures of the empire, yet the sense of belonging could be shaped by influences that did not originate within it. Before the Great War, the Balkan region did not stand apart from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was fully connected to it, both administratively and politically. At the same time, it introduced a level of complexity that reflected the limits of the empire's internal system. The balance that had been maintained across its territories now had to operate in a space where external pressures were more immediate and where the boundaries between internal and external challenges were less clearly defined. In this way, the Balkans became a place where the empire's existing patterns were not only present, but intensified, linking its internal structure to a wider and more uncertain environment. Beyond the borders of the empire, Serbia represented a different model of political development, one that gave clearer expression to the connection between national identity and statehood. Unlike the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where multiple identities coexisted within a single structure, Serbia defined itself more directly around a shared cultural and linguistic foundation. This distinction did not automatically lead to conflict, but it created a contrast that became increasingly significant over time. For South Slavic populations living within the empire, Serbia could be seen not only as a neighboring state, but as an example of how identity and political organization might align more closely. This perception was not uniform, nor did it lead to immediate action. Yet, it introduced an additional layer to how identity was understood in regions where imperial authority intersected with broader cultural connections. From the perspective of Austria-Hungary, Serbia's growing influence in the Balkans required careful attention. It was not simply a matter of territorial proximity, but of how ideas and expectations moved across borders. The empire had long managed diversity within its own framework, but Serbia's presence suggested an alternative framework, one in which national identity could serve as the primary basis for political organization. This idea, while not new, gained strength as Serbia expanded its role in the region during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Developments such as the Balkan Wars further altered the regional balance, increasing Serbia's visibility and influence. These changes did not directly disrupt the internal functioning of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they affected the environment in which that functioning took place. Russia, in turn, added another dimension to this evolving situation. As a major power with its own strategic interests, Russia positioned itself as a supporter of Slavic populations in southeastern Europe. This support was not purely ideological. It was also connected to broader geopolitical considerations. Nevertheless, it reinforced the sense that the Balkans were not only a regional concern, but part of a wider network of relationships between states. For Austria-Hungary, this meant that developments involving Serbia could not be viewed in isolation. They were linked to the actions and interests of a larger power, one that could influence the balance of the region in ways that extended beyond immediate control. This interplay between Serbia, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire created a situation in which internal and external dynamics became increasingly intertwined. Decisions made within the empire, particularly in regions like Bosnia, had implications that reached beyond its borders. At the same time, events outside the empire could shape conditions within it, influencing how different populations understood their position. The system that had been designed to manage internal diversity now had to operate in an environment where that diversity was connected to external forces. This did not produce a constant state of confrontation. Diplomatic relations continued, and the empire maintained its role within the broader European system. Yet the presence of these overlapping influences introduced a form of tension that was more difficult to contain through the methods that had previously maintained stability. Negotiation and balance remained important, but they now had to account for factors that were not fully within the empire's control. Before the Great War, this situation remained unresolved. The Austro-Hungarian Empire continued to function, its institutions operating, its territories governed. Serbia remained a neighboring state with its own trajectory, and Russia continued to play a role in the region. The relationships between them did not yet lead to a definitive outcome. Instead, they formed a context in which the empire's internal structure was increasingly connected to a wider and more dynamic environment. In this way, the Balkans became not only a geographical frontier, but a point where different models of political organization and influence met, shaping the conditions under which the empire would move forward. By the years leading up to 1914, the Balkan region had become a place where multiple layers of tension converged, not through a single cause, but through the accumulation of many different conditions. What made this convergence distinctive was not its intensity at any one moment, but the way it brought together forces that had been developing separately internal divisions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rise of national movements, and the involvement of neighboring states with their own ambitions. In the Balkans, these elements did not remain isolated. They intersected, shaping a situation in which local events could carry wider implications. The empire's presence in Bosnia and Herzegovina placed it directly within this environment. Administration continued, institutions functioned, and daily life moved forward, yet the region existed within a broader context that extended beyond imperial control. Identity in the Balkans was not confined to the structures of the empire. It was connected to cultural, linguistic, and historical ties that crossed borders, linking communities to ideas and movements that operated on a regional scale. This meant that developments within Bosnia or in neighboring areas could not be understood solely as internal matters. They were part of a network of relationships that included Serbia, Russia, and other actors whose interests overlapped in complex ways. As these connections deepened, the distinction between internal stability and external pressure became less clear. The Austro-Hungarian Empire continued to apply its established methods: administration, negotiation, and balance, but the environment in which these methods operated had changed. Local tensions could resonate beyond their immediate context, drawing attention and influence from outside the empire. At the same time, decisions made at the imperial level could affect not only internal dynamics, but also the broader regional balance. This created a situation in which the consequences of action or inaction extended further than before. The system was still capable of maintaining order, but it was doing so within a setting where the margin for error had become narrower. What had once been manageable differences now existed within a more interconnected framework. This did not produce constant crisis. Much of the time, conditions remained controlled, and the empire continued to function as it had in previous years, yet the nature of stability had shifted. It was no longer sustained only by internal balance, but also by the absence of events that might connect these different layers of tension more directly. The system could hold, but it depended on a careful alignment of factors that were not entirely predictable. In this sense, the Balkans did not create a new problem for the empire. They revealed the extent to which existing problems were already connected. Internal divisions, economic contrasts, political structures, and external influences all met in this region, forming a landscape where the consequences of any single development could extend beyond its original scope. The empire's capacity to manage complexity remained, but it was now operating in an environment where complexity was no longer contained within its own borders. Before the Great War, this condition did not yet lead to a definitive outcome. The Austro-Hungarian Empire remained intact, its institutions active, its authority present across its territories. Serbia continued to assert its role, and Russia maintained its influence in the region. The relationships between these elements remained in motion, shaped by ongoing developments rather than a single decisive turning point. Yet the convergence that had taken place in the Balkans introduced a new quality to the situation. It created a context in which stability depended not only on managing individual tensions, but on the continued separation of forces that were increasingly connected. This separation could be maintained, but it required conditions to remain aligned in a way that left little room for disruption. In this way, the empire approached the years before 1914 not as a system on the verge of immediate collapse, but as one operating within a landscape where the balance it depended on had become more sensitive, more dependent on the absence of events that might bring its many tensions into direct interaction. By the early years of the 20th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire presented a picture that, at a distance, still suggested continuity. Its institutions were in place, its cities active, its administration functioning across a wide and varied territory. Trains moved along established routes, carrying goods and people between regions that, despite their differences, remained connected through shared systems. Government offices continued their work, processing decisions, maintaining order, and managing the daily requirements of governance. From this perspective, the empire appeared to endure not only in form, but in practice. It had not fragmented, nor had it been overtaken by the tensions that had gradually developed within it. The structure, created in 1867, was still intact, still guiding how power was distributed and how decisions were made. Yet this continuity carried a quieter dimension, one that became more apparent when viewed in relation to the forces that had been building over time. The empire had learned how to function with its complexities, how to maintain balance across its divisions, but in doing so, it had also reached a point where further adjustment became increasingly difficult. The systems that supported stability negotiation between Austria and Hungary, management of diverse populations, gradual responses to emerging issues were still in operation. At the same time, they were being asked to address conditions that extended beyond the scope for which they had been designed. National movements had grown more defined, economic contrasts more noticeable, and the connections between internal and external dynamics more immediate. These developments did not disrupt the empire all at once. Instead, they altered the environment in which it operated, introducing a level of complexity that required not only balance, but adaptation. The distinction between these two became increasingly significant. Balance could maintain the present. Adaptation required a shift in structure or direction. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, at this stage, remained more capable of the first than the second. Within Vienna and Budapest, governance continued along established lines. Political discussions addressed ongoing concerns, reforms were considered, and adjustments made where possible. Yet these processes unfolded within a framework that had remained largely unchanged for decades. The Compromise of 1867 still defined the relationship between the empire's two halves, and the broader system still reflected that original arrangement. This continuity provided stability, but it also limited the range of responses available to new challenges. Changes could be introduced, but they had to fit within an existing structure that was not easily altered without affecting its overall balance. Across the empire, daily life reflected this condition. People continued to work, trade, and participate in the systems that connected them to one another. Cultural life remained active, local communities maintained their traditions, and the presence of the state was experienced through familiar institutions. Yet the broader questions of identity, representation, and the distribution of power remained open. They were not resolved, but managed, held within a system that allowed them to exist without requiring immediate answers. This created a form of stability that was real but conditional. It depended on the continued alignment of many factors, each of which had become more complex over time. Before 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood in this condition. It was not in visible decline, nor was it fully at ease. It continued to function, sustained by the structures that had carried it through previous decades. Yet those same structures now defined the limits of its response to a changing world. The empire had reached a point where its ability to maintain balance remained strong, but its capacity to transform that balance into something more enduring had become increasingly uncertain. What makes this final period particularly difficult to recognize, even in retrospect, is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not appear to be approaching an endpoint. There was no clear signal, no decisive moment that marked a transition from stability to collapse. Instead, the empire continued to operate within the patterns it had developed over decades. Its institutions remained active, its administrative processes continued, and its political life unfolded with a familiarity that suggested persistence rather than change. From within the system, there was little reason to assume that it was nearing a limit. The structures that had maintained balance before were still in place, still functioning in ways that had proven effective over time. This created a condition that might be described not as decline, but as continuation without clear direction. The empire was not moving toward a defined transformation, nor was it retreating from its existing form. It was, in many ways, maintaining itself, responding to immediate needs, adjusting where necessary, and preserving the arrangements that allowed it to function. This mode of operation had been a strength, enabling the empire to endure complexity without requiring constant restructuring. Yet in this period, it also meant that deeper questions remained unaddressed, not because they were ignored, but because they did not yet demand a single, decisive response within the existing framework. From the perspective of those living within the empire, this continuity shaped expectations. Daily life did not suggest that a fundamental shift was imminent. Economic activity continued, institutions operated, and the presence of the state remained consistent. Even in regions where tensions existed, they were often experienced as part of an ongoing condition, rather than as signs of an approaching break. The empire had long managed such conditions, and there was an underlying assumption that it would continue to do so. This assumption was not unreasonable, given the absence of immediate disruption. It reflected a system that had proven capable of absorbing pressure without losing its overall structure. Yet, this very capacity contributed to a form of inertia. Because the system could continue, it did not need to redefine itself quickly. Because it did not need to redefine itself, it remained within a framework that had been shaped by earlier conditions. Over time, this created a subtle disconnection between the stability that was maintained and the changes that were taking place around it. The empire was still functioning, but the context in which it functioned had evolved. National identities had become more politically defined, economic differences more interconnected with social and cultural dynamics, and external pressures more closely linked to internal conditions. These developments did not immediately disrupt the system, but they altered the environment in which it operated. This state of continuation, without clear transformation, introduced a kind of waiting, not a deliberate pause, but a condition in which the empire moved forward without fully engaging with the direction of that movement. It was not waiting for a specific event, nor was it anticipating a particular outcome. Rather, it existed within a balance that could be maintained as long as its underlying conditions did not shift too abruptly. This made stability dependent not only on internal management, but also on the absence of changes that might require a different kind of response. Before the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire remained within this condition. It was not a system that had ceased to function, nor one that had resolved its complexities. It was a system that continued, sustained by the very mechanisms that also limited its capacity to move beyond them. This created a quiet tension, not visible as crisis, but present in the gap between what the empire was able to maintain and what it might eventually be required to become. In this final moment before everything would be set into motion, the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not stand as a structure in visible crisis, but as one that had become accustomed to its own complexity. It had learned how to endure without fully resolving, how to balance without fully uniting, and how to continue without fully transforming. Across its territories, life moved forward with a quiet regularity. People worked, studied, traveled, and lived within systems that, though intricate, remained familiar. The empire's presence was not abstract, it was experienced through institutions, through administration, through the patterns of daily life that connected its many regions. Yet beneath this continuity lay a deeper condition that had been building across all the elements we have followed. The political structure, shaped by compromise, maintained balance but limited change. The diversity of its populations created richness, but also prevented the formation of a shared identity. Its administrative system ensured order, yet slowed decisive action. Its economy connected regions, while also dividing them through uneven development. Its military unified in form, but carried within it the same layered identities as the society it served. And at its edges, particularly in the Balkans, internal tensions had become inseparable from external forces. None of these factors alone determined an outcome. Each could be managed, adjusted, and absorbed within the system. What made this moment different was not the presence of these conditions, but their convergence. They existed together, interacting quietly, shaping a structure that remained intact while becoming increasingly sensitive to disruption. This sensitivity was not visible in the way a fracture might be. It was present in the way balance had to be maintained carefully, continuously, and across many dimensions at once. The empire could still hold, but it depended on the continued alignment of forces that were no longer entirely within its control. What this reveals is not simply a story about one empire, but a broader reflection on how complex systems endure. Stability in such systems does not always come from unity or resolution. It can emerge from the ability to manage difference, to create arrangements that allow diverse elements to coexist without fully merging. This form of stability can be remarkably durable. It can sustain a system for decades, even as underlying conditions evolve. Yet it also carries a limit. When change begins to affect multiple parts of the system at once, when internal and external pressures become connected, the methods that once maintained balance may no longer be sufficient on their own. The Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Great War illustrates this condition with particular clarity. It was not undone by a single weakness, nor by a single decision. It was shaped by a structure that could continue without resolving its deepest questions, and by a context that gradually made those questions more difficult to contain. This does not make its history inevitable, nor does it reduce it to a simple lesson. Instead, it invites a different kind of understanding, one that looks at how systems function over time, how they respond to complexity, and how they adapt or fail to adapt when the conditions around them begin to change. In the quiet years before 1914, the empire remained what it had long been, a vast, intricate structure capable of holding together many different parts without becoming one. It did not yet know what would come next, and in many ways, it did not need to know. It continued, as it always had, within a balance that seemed sufficient in the present. And so the question remains, not only for this empire, but for any system built on such foundations, when a structure can endure for so long without resolving its deepest tensions, is its strength found in that endurance, or in the change it has yet to face?